Hey y'all, if you want to see the process behind making the Sierra Bella ring, then just keep watching. First I start off making my bezel, which encloses the stone to keep it from falling out. I'm using a bit of a taller bezel for today. Typically I use a 3/16 or 1/8 inch, but this is a 1/4 inch 24 gauge, and I'll just sand down the excess when the time comes. For my pliers, I'm going to be using flat nose, flush cutters, and plastic tip to keep from marring my metal. Before shaping, I make sure that my beginning end is already flat and filed. That way I'm not losing any length where I would need to file afterwards. I try to avoid having the solder seam in the corner because it could create difficulties when you set your stone if you use too much solder. Next, I'll be marking my bezel where I want the next corner to be. This just makes it a bit easier and saves time, but you'll still have to adjust your bezel a little bit. Sharp corner stones are pretty difficult to create bezels for, but the more you practice, the better they'll get. I'll be repeating the same process all the way around my cab. I like to press my bezel and cab against a flat surface to really form it to it and to get an even fit. For circular stones, you can do the same thing, but with a rolling motion while pulling the wire. Be sure and mark your metal where the ends meet. You're better off cutting too little than too much off. Since I'm using a tall wire, my cutters aren't big enough to cut it, so I'm just going to be sawing through this. I've used this Burlife stuff from Rio Grande for over 3 years now, and I haven't had to buy a new one yet. It's great for saw blades and files, and it just lets you continue the motion without having your tools yank around unevenly. Confirm that the size and the fit of your bezel is still good, because your next step will be aligning the ends for a flush solder joint. I use my flat nose pliers to make the ends even, and then you're left with just adjusting the level of flushness. Do some crisscross and push-pull motions and you should be good to go. It's better to spend a minute getting a good flush joint, or you'll end up having to file and sand a lot of excess solder and metal afterwards, and it just becomes a mess. You'll want to start your piece with solder that has the highest melting point. In this case, I'm using hard. Although there is extra hard solder, I don't find that necessary because my pieces aren't terribly intricate. If I had done a lot of components, that may be something that I go for. Now I'm on to creating decorative stamps for my piece. Designing on paper lays a great foundation, and you can also keep it in your sketchbook to look back on, but sometimes you can't create everything exactly as you designed because you can't account for the excess metal around your stamps, thickness of decorative wires, bezels, etc. Although stamping is pretty straightforward, you still want to consider the pressure of your hits, the angle of your stamp, and the thickness of your metal. If I'm going to whack my hardest at a super fine 24 gauge, I very well may go through my metal and leave a hole. Just be sure to keep a consistent grip on your stamp and give a few hits rocking in each direction. I found 22 gauge works best for most of my projects. Now I'm sawing out each stamp. Before doing so, I took a permanent marker and drew roughly where I wanted to saw out the decoration. This is going to save you a ton of time when you file and sand. Moving on to decorative wires, I'm using this 12 gauge twisted one, and I'll later be working with a 1.9mm full bead wire. I start using my plastic tip pliers to form my piece. If you're using a real thick gauge, I would recommend annealing it beforehand to make it a bit easier. Finally, I have my components ready, so now I can see how the design is looking once I lay it out. I'm using 20 gauge dead soft sheet. You can get away with 22, but the thinner you go, the more risk you'll have for the durability and the longevity of your ring. I've seen ring shanks tear through backplates on big rings because the backplate wasn't strong enough to support the large design. For a necklace or earrings, you don't really run into this risk as much, but it's up to you to decide what is best for your piece. After tracing around my piece, I'll saw it out and put my maker's mark on the back. Now it's time to prep my components. I'm using some sanding discs to flatten the bottom of each piece. I believe one of these is 220 grit and the other is a higher, more fine grit for smoother sanding. Now it's time to solder. I'm using 22 gauge hard solder for these components. After soldering and quenching your piece, it's time to put it in your pickle. A hack that I learned is to use a plastic cup with holes so you don't lose your components in your acid mixture. I added my solder to my piece and I heated it slowly but surely to try and keep the bubbling from moving the decorations around and out of place. A tip I learned for larger pieces that get very hot is to wait 20 to 30 seconds for it to cool because your metal can crack on the back plate if you quench it too early. I decided on a stamp band for this piece, so I'm just going to do that real quick. For a split shank, I discovered it's easiest to bend your wire before soldering. In the past, I would solder two flat wires flush with each other, measure where I wanted them to split, and then I would saw through them and then file the rough insides. Not only did that cost me a lot of time, but the results were not as clean as my current method. Be sure to file each piece to have two flush surfaces before you solder. You should also file or sand the ends of your shank prior to shaping. It's a lot easier to do this beforehand than to try to find the proper rotary bits to get the job done after you solder. After forming the ring band, start to file the ends of your band until you can sit the shank on a steel block and balance it. I use medium solder to solder the shank to the back plate. If you melt the solder on the tips before the back plate, you will have virtually no excess solder to clean up. You also won't have to chase around the solder while trying to keep the shank aligned and in place. Unfortunately, I forgot to record my last soldering steps. It was the shank to the back plate and then the decorative stamp to the back plate alongside the shank. Once I was all done soldering, I completed my polish routine, which I do have a separate video on. For antiquing and oxidizing, I use and have always used Black Max from Rio Grande. This is my second bottle I bought and I've been smithing for over 3 years. The product always works flawlessly as long as your metal is clean. I use a paintbrush from Michaels, but I've also seen folks use Q-tips and watercolor dispensers. Now it's time to hit this with my pink silicone polishing wheel from Deco. Then I'll throw this piece in the tumbler for at least 2 hours. I can get away with 1 hour, but since this piece is intricate with lots of nooks and crannies, I'm going to do at least 2. It's now time to set the stone. I have a video on stone setting as well if you guys wanted to check that out. Just be careful of rectangular or sharp angled bezels. Start on the corners and then close each of the opposing walls inward. Hours later, my piece is finally complete. I hope y'all enjoyed watching this video and the process of how your one-of-a-kind jewelry is created. If y'all have any questions or recommendations for future videos, be sure and let me know and I'd love to make it happen. To see more content, check out my Instagram and TikTok, rugged_earth. Thank y'all for watching.